Husband brings lover to wife's will reading. What happens next will shock you. Hook. After his wife's mysterious death, he takes his lover to the reading of the will. But what happens next will shock you. This twisted journey is far from over. Are you ready for the unexpected turn? Stay with us until the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The lawyer's office was cold. The air smelled of dust and old leather. Thomas shifted in his seat, eyes glancing around. His fingers drummed on the armrest. Beside him, Claire sat still. Her fingers were clenched, almost hidden in the folds of her coat. She hadn't spoken since they arrived. It didn't matter. Thomas could feel the weight of her presence, like an anchor holding him down. The old wooden clock on the wall ticked louder than it should. Each second seemed to stretch, each one a needle driving into his chest. He was trying to focus, trying to remember the reasons he was here. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It shouldn't have felt so wrong. The lawyer, Mr. Hanley, finally walked in. He had a thick folder in his hands. He looked down at Thomas, then at Claire. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed somewhere far away. Hanley sat down, slowly. The air in the room grew heavier. "Shall we begin?" he asked. Thomas nodded, though his throat felt tight. The first lines of the will were read. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But then something changed. Thomas felt a strange tightening in his chest. It started small, like a whisper, but grew louder. Hanley's voice seemed to fade. His words lost meaning. It was as if the room had grown darker. The lawyer paused. He looked at Thomas, then at Claire. For the first time, his expression faltered. He cleared his throat. His fingers trembled slightly as they flipped through the pages. "Thomas," Hanley began, his voice almost a whisper, "there's an addition to the will." Thomas leaned forward. Claire's eyes flickered. She turned her head slightly, but her face was unreadable. Hanley continued, "This was added just days before Mrs. Porter's death." Thomas froze. His mind raced, but nothing made sense. Why had she done this? He swallowed hard. His palms were clammy. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. "Claire," Hanley said, looking directly at her. Thomas looked at her too. Claire's face was pale. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. But it wasn't fear in her eyes. It was something colder. The lawyer read on. The will's final stipulation. It left everything to Claire. Not just the house, not just the money, everything. The room seemed to close in. Thomas couldn't breathe. He wanted to shout, but his voice caught in his throat. And then he saw it. The final line, hidden beneath the others. "If my husband is present at the reading, he forfeits all claims to my estate." His world tilted. His stomach churned. His hands clenched into fists. Claire had known. She had known all along. "Why?" His voice barely broke the silence. Claire finally looked at him. Her expression was calm, unreadable. "Because," she said softly, "it was never yours to begin with." The words hung in the air. And suddenly, everything felt wrong. That Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. His skin prickled with a cold sweat. The room felt like it was spinning, tilting at a sickening angle. Claire's gaze didn't waver. Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. It was all too much to process. The betrayal, the shock. It hit him like a blow to the head. "I don't understand," Thomas whispered, his voice shaky, barely audible. His breath came in short bursts. "You never were the beneficiary," Claire said, her voice calm, almost gentle, as if explaining something simple. "You never had any claim to her money, her estate." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas could feel his pulse thudding in his ears. The truth was sinking in, a slow, agonizing realization. All this time, he had been living a lie. Claire's eyes locked with his, and for the first time, Thomas saw something darker there. She wasn't the woman he thought she was. Her perfect facade cracked open, revealing something more sinister. "You think this was about love, Thomas?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp, like a knife's edge. "It was never about love. It was always about power." Thomas wanted to scream, wanted to stand up and run, but he couldn't move. His limbs felt heavy, his chest tight with disbelief. Hanley cleared his throat. He glanced at Claire, then back at Thomas. "I'm afraid, Mr. Porter, there's more to this will." Thomas blinked, his mind racing. "More? How could there possibly be more?" "Your wife," Hanley said, "also left you a final letter, to be read after the reading of the will." Thomas's breath caught. A letter? What could she have possibly written? Hanley passed the letter across the table. Thomas took it, trembling. His fingers shook as he broke the seal. He unfolded the paper, reading the familiar handwriting, though it felt distant, strangely foreign now. "Thomas," it began, "by the time you read this, it will be too late. I knew you would not understand, but I had no choice." Thomas's stomach dropped. His mind screamed for clarity, but the words blurred before his eyes. "I loved you once," the letter continued, "but it was always Claire I was meant to be with. You were just a pawn, a way to ensure I could control everything." He couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in. The room grew colder. "Claire is my sister," the letter said, "and you, Thomas, are the fool who never saw it." The letter fell from his hands, crumpled on the floor. Thomas looked at Claire, his mind reeling. Sister? She was his wife's sister? But then it hit him. The similarities, the little things he had overlooked, the shared glances, the secretive smiles. Claire's expression softened for a moment, but it was no comfort. It was just a mask. "Don't look so surprised," she said, standing slowly. "I told you it was never yours." The weight of her words crushed him. His whole life, everything he had built, had been a lie. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why do this?" Claire stepped closer. Her breath was warm on his face. "You were never part of the plan, Thomas. You were just a stepping stone." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. His world was unraveling, piece by piece, and in the silence that followed, he understood, his vision blurred. The words, the betrayal, it all crashed together in a rush. Claire's face remained cold, no trace of remorse. She was the one pulling the strings, all along. "You should have known better," she whispered. Her voice was ice. "Everyone knew. Everyone but you." Thomas's chest tightened. His breath came in shallow gasps. The truth was suffocating. He had been played. Suddenly, a sharp noise sliced through the air. A door creaked open. Thomas whipped around. The lawyer, Hanley, was standing by the door, his face pale, almost terrified. He stepped forward, but his gaze flickered nervously to Claire. "You didn't know," Hanley stammered. His eyes were wide, shifting between Claire and Thomas. He looked afraid. Thomas could barely speak. His mouth was dry. His heart thundered in his chest. He felt trapped. Claire turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hanley," she said, her tone even, "this was always part of the plan. You were the one who helped me." Hanley shifted uncomfortably, his fingers trembling. He seemed to realize something, as if he had been caught in a web. He had never fully understood. "Yes," he said after a pause, almost in a whisper. "Yes, I knew. But not the whole truth." Thomas's eyes widened. What was he talking about? Had there been something more? Claire smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course you didn't know. You were never supposed to." Her eyes flickered toward the door, as if considering something, a shift in her demeanor. For the first time, Thomas felt a chill down his spine. Something was about to happen. He could hear the wind howling outside, a distant storm brewing. The air felt heavier, like a storm was closing in on him, not just outside, but in the very room. "Thomas," Claire said, her voice low, almost soothing, "there's one more thing I should mention." Thomas felt his breath hitch. His mind raced, but his body remained frozen in place. Claire stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "There's a second part to my sister's will," she continued. "She didn't leave you empty-handed." Thomas's mind struggled to catch up. Empty-handed? What could she have possibly meant? Before he could ask, Claire's lips parted, and the words came out slowly, each one sinking deeper into him. "Your inheritance," she said, her voice dripping with an unsettling calm, "isn't just money." Thomas blinked, his hands trembling. What was she saying? Claire stepped closer, a sinister gleam in her eyes. "Your inheritance is your punishment." The weight of her words hit him like a punch. Punishment? What could she mean? He felt his heart racing, as if something was coming for him, something he couldn't see. But before he could react, Hanley spoke again, his voice shaking. "Thomas, you don't understand. There's more you haven't seen." The room seemed to grow colder still. The walls pressed in. The weight of the situation was crushing. And then, the door slammed shut. The last thing Thomas heard was Claire's soft laugh, and the unmistakable click of a lock that Thomas's heart skipped a beat. The sound of the door locking echoed in his ears. The air became thick, heavy with dread. He was trapped. Panic surged through him. He rushed to the door, his hands fumbling for the handle. It wouldn't budge. Claire's voice, smooth and cold, floated toward him. "It's no use, Thomas. You can't leave now." He turned, wild-eyed, looking for any escape. His mind raced, but the room seemed smaller, the walls closing in. "You think you've been living in a dream, but you've been living in my nightmare," Claire continued, her voice dripping with venom. Hanley stood by the window now, his back pressed against the wall. He was no longer the confident lawyer, but a man caught in the wake of something much darker. "I didn't know," he whispered, his face pale and twisted with guilt. "I didn't know the full extent of it." Thomas turned toward him, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "What are you talking about? What's happening?" Claire smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent a chill through his bones. "You really don't understand, do you?" she said softly. "You've been played, Thomas. From the start." She stepped closer. Her heels clicked sharply on the floor, each sound punctuating the suffocating silence. Her eyes never left his face. "I told you the inheritance wasn't just money. It was never about money, Thomas. It's about control. It's about what you owe me." Thomas's mind raced. Owed her? What did that even mean? He turned to Hanley, desperation flooding his voice. "You have to help me. You don't know what she's doing." But Hanley only shook his head. "I can't," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I can't help you anymore. It's too late for that." Claire's eyes gleamed with something dark, something ancient and powerful. The will was just the beginning. "Thomas, you never really knew me." Thomas's legs weakened, his vision dimming as a wave of nausea washed over him. Something was wrong. So terribly wrong. He stumbled backward, his breath ragged in his throat. He could feel the walls closing in. This wasn't just about money or betrayal. This was something far worse. Claire's hand reached out, lightning fast. Her fingers gripped his wrist with an unnatural strength. "You're mine now," she whispered. His pulse hammered in his throat, but he couldn't escape her grip. His mind scrambled for answers, but everything was slipping away. He tried to pull free, but it was as though her touch was rooted in something deeper, something far older than he understood. You thought you could take everything from me. She murmured, her voice almost a chant now. You thought you could steal her from me. But you didn't know. Her grip tightened. He gasped for air. His vision blurred. Everything was spinning. I am the one who controls it all. She finished, her voice low and chilling. Suddenly, the room went dark. Completely, utterly dark. And in the silence, Thomas felt a coldness grip his very soul. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The darkness swallowed him whole. It pressed in on all sides, a suffocating blackness that seemed to stretch beyond the walls. Thomas's breath quickened, but the air felt thick, as though he were breathing underwater. The silence was deafening. Then a whisper, barely audible at first. It came from everywhere, surrounding him like an invisible force. His name, Thomas. His heart thudded in his chest. It was Claire's voice, but it wasn't the Claire he had known. This was something colder, something ancient. He stumbled back, but his feet wouldn't obey him. He was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The whispering grew louder, closer, until it filled his ears, rattling his skull. Do you understand now? Thomas's chest constricted. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth felt dry. His throat closed off, as if something was smothering him. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive, with some malevolent energy. And then the temperature plummeted. Ice crept into his bones, numbing him. Claire's voice again, but this time it was different. There was an edge to it, a taint of something unnatural. You thought you were just part of the game, Thomas, but you were never just a player. The ground beneath him trembled, like an earthquake, but he couldn't see it, couldn't feel anything except the cold. Claire, what are you doing? His voice cracked, barely a whisper. I'm taking what's mine, she replied, the voice like a chorus of hundreds, echoing from every corner. And suddenly Thomas felt it, a cold, unearthly presence behind him. His skin crawled as if the very air had become poisonous. He turned slowly. The darkness parted, just enough for him to see her. Claire stood there, but she wasn't the Claire he knew. Her eyes glowed, unnaturally bright, like the light of a dying star. Her lips curled into a cruel smile. Did you think you could escape me, Thomas? Thomas stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. His body screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. No, no. The shadows around Claire seemed to shift, rippling like liquid. The room was no longer just a room. It was a cage, a trap closing in. I told you, Claire whispered, her voice now barely audible, yet it cut through him like a knife. You were never meant to be part of this. You were always just a means to an end. Her hands reached out toward him, fingers elongated, twisting unnaturally. And in that moment, he understood. The inheritance, the will. It was never about money. It was never about anything material. It was about something far darker, something that had been passed down through generations. Thomas was never meant to inherit wealth. He was meant to inherit something far worse, something that had been locked away for centuries, something that now had a new vessel. And as Claire's fingers closed around his throat, the darkness surged forward, devouring him whole. There would be no escape. The cold burned through him, sharp like ice scraping his skin. Claire's grip tightened. He tried to scream, but the sound was trapped inside his chest. Unable to escape, the darkness seemed to pull him deeper, further into itself. He felt himself slipping away, his vision narrowing. Claire's eyes gleamed, her smile widening. Her form seemed to shift, distorting like a mirage in the dark. You were never meant to fight it, she whispered, her voice now a deep, resonant hum, almost a chant. The walls around him pulsed with an eerie light, flickering like dying stars. And then, through the suffocating void, he felt something else, a presence, larger than life, older than time itself. It pressed into him, a force that made the very air feel thick with dread. His lungs burned for air, but it was as if the darkness had taken it all. "Stop," he managed to choke out, his voice barely a rasp. "Please." But Claire only laughed, a soft, chilling sound that echoed endlessly around him. "It's too late for you, Thomas." Her voice shifted, becoming something far more ancient, like a deep, hollow echo from another world. The shadows around her twisted, forming shapes that were not human, but something else, something monstrous. In the flickering darkness, he saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't just his wife's sister. She wasn't just a woman driven by greed. Claire was the key, the gateway. She had never been just a pawn in the game. She had always been the one pulling the strings. Thomas's mind reeled. There was no escape, no way out of this web she had woven. But in that moment, just as the darkness seemed to close in completely, he saw something, a glimpse of light, a small spark amid the void. His instinct screamed at him, a final, desperate instinct to survive. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he fought back. He didn't know how, but he pushed against her grip, his body shaking with the effort. The shadows wavered, flickered, as though the dark itself was losing its hold. For a split second, the darkness faltered. Claire's face twisted with surprise. "Impossible," she breathed. In that moment of weakness, he broke free. With every ounce of his remaining strength, he lunged for the door. He threw himself against it, his shoulder slamming into the wood. The door buckled, the lock splintering under his weight. He was free, but Claire's voice, low and furious, rang out behind him. "You can't escape, Thomas. You can never escape." The darkness surged, reaching for him, but he ran faster, his breath ragged, his legs unsteady. The walls seemed to shift, to close in, but he refused to stop. The door burst open. He tumbled out into the night, gasping for air, the cool wind cutting through his lungs. But even as he ran, he knew it wasn't over. The darkness was still there, following, waiting for him to turn around. He didn't dare look back. Not yet. Thomas's breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning his lungs. His legs moved faster, pounding against the ground, as if he could outrun the horror he'd left behind. The wind howled around him, blowing his coat against his body, but he didn't care. He could feel the cold bite through his skin, but it was nothing compared to the terror gnawing at his insides. He stumbled forward, his mind a frantic blur. The shadows still clung to him, to his thoughts, to every part of him. No matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the suffocating grip of what had happened. The trees on the edge of the estate blurred past him, their skeletal branches twisting like fingers reaching for him. Every shadow seemed alive, moving in the corner of his vision, his heart hammered in his chest, each beat loud in his ears. But he kept running. He couldn't stop. The estate was behind him now, but the feeling of being hunted lingered, like a shadow at his back. Suddenly his foot caught on something. He tumbled forward, his hands scraping the frozen ground. He barely had time to push himself up before he heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper, drifting on the wind. "Thomas." His blood ran cold. The voice. It was Claire's. He looked around, but there was nothing, only the darkened trees and the road stretching before him. "Thomas, you can't run from me." The whisper grew louder, closer. He turned, his eyes scanning the shadows, but he saw nothing. The darkness was pressing in again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just around him. It was inside him, in his very soul. "Stop running, Thomas," Claire's voice said. But it wasn't Claire anymore. It was something else. Something that didn't belong to the world he knew. The ground beneath his feet trembled, a low, rhythmic thrum, as though the earth itself was alive. His pulse quickened. "Thomas," came the voice again, soft and smooth, like silk wrapping around his brain. "It's too late. You belong to me now." He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, as though the very air had thickened, pinning him down. The darkness swirled around him, growing thicker. He could feel it in his chest, tightening with each breath. "Why?" he gasped. His voice cracked. "Why are you doing this?" A laugh echoed from the shadows. It was Claire's laugh, but not her laugh. It was twisted, mocking. "Because you never understood, Thomas," the voice said, growing louder, resonating deep within him. "You were always meant to be a vessel, a tool to bring me back. And now..." The darkness surged forward, flooding his mind, his body, until he could no longer separate himself from it. Claire's face flashed in his mind, but it wasn't the woman he had married. It was something darker, something ancient and hungry. "You're not free," the voice purred, as the darkness consumed him. "You never were." And then, just like that, he was gone. The wind howled in the distance, and the trees stood silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The night stretched on, empty and still. The wind whispered through the trees, but there was no sign of Thomas. The estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood silent, its windows dark and lifeless. Claire remained inside, but she was no longer just Claire. She had changed, transformed by the shadows that had consumed her, the darkness that had always been a part of her. The air around the house grew thick with a strange energy, like the calm before a storm. But it wasn't just a storm outside. It was inside, settling deep in the very walls of the house. Claire stood in the center of the room, her eyes closed. Her breath was slow, measured, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. A low hum filled the room, a sound that seemed to vibrate in her chest, a sound that resonated with the deepening darkness. She smiled, but it was not a smile of triumph. It was something darker, colder. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as though the house itself were breathing, waiting for something, waiting for her. Outside, the wind picked up again, whipping through the trees, but it felt different now, as if the world itself had shifted. Something had changed. Something had been awakened. Claire opened her eyes, her gaze distant, lost in a place Thomas would never see. The power was hers now, the inheritance, the darkness. She had called it, and it had answered. Her fingers twitched, as if feeling for the threads of control that stretched through the air, through the very fabric of reality. The world around her was hers to command. Everything was hers now, and in the silence that followed, as the wind howled through the trees, a figure appeared at the edge of the estate, a shadow. It moved slowly, shifting with the wind, but there's something familiar about it. Claire's lips curled into a smile. "I knew you would come back, Thomas," she whispered to herself. The shadow approached, growing clearer with each step. But this time, it wasn't Thomas. It was something else. A dark figure, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Claire didn't flinch. She stood her ground, waiting. The figure reached the gate, its form solidifying in the dim light. And as it stepped into the yard, the ground beneath it seemed to shudder. "Welcome home," Claire murmured. And then, with a final, eerie silence, the figure stepped into the house. The figure moved closer, its presence casting an even deeper shadow. It wasn't human, not anymore. Claire's smile never faltered as she watched it approach, her eyes gleaming with a mix of anticipation and something far darker. The figure stopped just before the door, its features becoming clearer in the dim light. It was Thomas, but not Thomas. His eyes were wide, unfocused, glowing faintly, a dull light that didn't belong to the living. His skin was pale, drawn tight over the bones, as though life itself had been drained from him. Claire tilted her head, studying him. "There you are," she whispered, her voice full of something almost tender. Thomas, or what had been Thomas, stood still, his gaze fixed on her, but his movements were sluggish, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "You're here now," she said, stepping closer, her fingers brushing against his arm. "It's all finally come together." He didn't respond. His eyes flickered, but there was no recognition in them, no trace of the man he once was. Claire's smile deepened. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "You were always going to be mine, Thomas," she murmured, her hand tracing a delicate line across his cheek. "The moment you walked into that house, the moment you trusted me, you sealed your fate." Thomas's body twitched, his hand moving ever so slightly, as though trying to break free. But it was useless. Claire chuckled softly. "There's no escaping me now." She moved back to the center of the room, her voice taking on a more commanding tone. The air in the house grew thicker, pulsing with energy. "Everything is finally where it should be." Her words were low, almost like an incantation, a promise that things would never be the same. The darkness that had once threatened to consume her now seemed to rise up at her command, shifting and writhing in the corners of the room. It felt alive, aware of its power. She turned back to Thomas, her gaze unwavering. "Are you ready?" The figure of Thomas didn't move, but there was a shift in his eyes, a flicker of something beneath the surface. Claire's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. No matter what had changed, he was hers. With a slow, deliberate motion, she extended her hand toward him. "Come," she whispered. "Let's finish this." Thomas's body lurched forward, his limbs jerking as though resisting. But he moved. He walked toward her, slowly, mechanically, a puppet in her grasp. As he reached her, she grasped his hand. The room seemed to go still. The darkness swirled around them both, reaching out as if to embrace them. The pulse in the air grew stronger, the power between them thickening. Claire's eyes glowed with a fierce, almost frenzied light. Her lips parted in a breathless laugh. "Now, Thomas, now you'll see what you were always meant to be." And as she spoke, the shadows pressed in, wrapping around them both, until there was nothing left but the thick, suffocating blackness. Outside, the wind howled once more, but no one would hear it. Not anymore. The darkness swallowed them both whole. It was like drowning in thick, suffocating fog, a silence so deep it felt like it could crush the very bones. Claire's laugh echoed in the void, but it wasn't a sound that comforted. It was jagged, unnatural, the kind of laugh that made your skin crawl. Thomas stood still beside her, his body no longer his own. His eyes flickered with fleeting recognition, but it was a distant thing, like the last glimmer of light before everything went dark. Claire's grip on his hand tightened, and the air around them seemed to pulse. Vibrating with energy, the shadows rippled, shifting like liquid, forming shapes, figures, faces, but none of them were real. "This is it, Thomas," Claire whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "This is where it ends." Her voice was almost a chant now, something ritualistic, like she was speaking the words that would unravel everything. The shadows closed in tighter, wrapping around them like tendrils, drawing them deeper into the dark. Thomas felt it, a sharp, sudden pang in his chest, a flicker of something that wasn't his own. The darkness, the force that had taken hold of him, wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about Claire and her twisted obsession. There was something else, something ancient, something alive, pulsing in the very marrow of the earth. He fought it. A flicker of resistance sparked deep inside him. But Claire's voice came again, commanding, unwavering. No, Thomas, you don't get to choose anymore. Her fingers dug into his skin, pain sharp, piercing through the haze of the shadows. The darkness swelled around them, thrashing, writhing like a living thing. It was feeding, growing stronger, darker. And then, as if in answer, a terrible, low growl filled the air. It wasn't a sound made by any human, but something older, something primal. Claire froze, her eyes wide, as the shadows seemed to twist and shift in response. A shape began to form in the darkness. A figure, massive, its outline indistinct, but its presence undeniable. Thomas could feel it, like a weight pressing on his chest. It was no longer just Claire who controlled the shadows. It was something far older, something far more dangerous. The figure loomed, growing larger with each passing second. Claire's voice quivered as she whispered, "What is this?" The shape surged forward, its form becoming more solid, its presence more powerful. For the first time since Thomas had entered this nightmare, he felt a flicker of hope. The thing in the shadows. It wasn't there to serve Claire. It was there to destroy her. The darkness recoiled, as if in pain, as the figure emerged fully into the lightless room. Claire stepped back, her face paling as she realized the truth. This wasn't part of the plan. The creature's eyes gleamed, a terrifying, fiery red, its mouth a jagged maw of endless darkness. With one powerful, terrifying movement, the shadows that had once obeyed Claire now turned, as if repelled by the creature's presence. "No," Claire shouted, her voice shrill with panic. "This is mine. You can't take this from me." But the creature didn't listen. It moved toward her with relentless speed, its presence radiating pure, unfiltered terror. Thomas felt it, the weight of its hunger, the sheer power of the ancient thing. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was free. He staggered backward, his limbs trembling, the last remnants of control slipping from his grasp. But Claire was still there, desperately reaching toward the darkness that had once been hers. The creature's maw opened, and with a single deafening roar, the shadows that had once enveloped the house collapsed inward. There was a flash of blinding light, and then nothing. Silence. The oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted, leaving nothing but the heavy stillness of the void behind. Thomas blinked, his senses reeling, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He was alone. The air was no longer thick with malice. No more whispers, no more unsettling presence. Just quiet. His body trembled, but the adrenaline had begun to fade. He was still standing, still alive, but everything else felt like it had been swallowed whole. He took a step forward, his mind clouded, his heart still racing. Where had Claire gone? Where had the creature gone? He looked around. The room was dim, almost normal, except for the sense that something crucial was missing. The shadows no longer reached for him. There were no eerie whispers, no heavy air pressing in on him. Everything was still. Everything was empty. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw something on the floor, a shape. It was Claire. Her body lay crumpled at the center of the room, motionless, a look of pure terror frozen on her face. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Was she dead? He moved closer, hesitant, his footsteps quiet in the vast emptiness. He knelt beside her, his hand shaking as he touched her cold, lifeless skin. There was no warmth, no pulse, nothing, but something caught his eye, something in her hand, a small, jagged object. It looked like a shard of something, a broken relic, maybe. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He recognized it. It was the same dark shard that had been in the house since the beginning, the one his wife had hidden away, the one that had started all of this. He grasped the shard carefully, his fingers wrapping around the cold surface. Suddenly, the room shifted again. The walls seemed to breathe, like the house itself was coming alive. A deep rumbling sound filled the air. The floor beneath him trembled. The shadows stirred once more. But this time, they weren't creeping toward him. They were gathering in the center of the room, swirling in an unsettling vortex. The ground split open. A deep crack ran along the floor, growing wider. Out of the crack came a low, guttural growl, the same sound he had heard before. Something was awakening, something that hadn't fully emerged, but had been lurking beneath the surface all along. Thomas's eyes widened as the shadows seemed to form a figure once more, but this time it was different. It was no longer the creature that had almost torn Claire apart. This was something worse. The shadows coalesced into a tall, thin figure. Its eyes glowed a fierce, blinding red, its shape indistinct but menacing, writhing with energy. ***. The voice was not Claire's. It was deeper. It was ancient. The figure moved, the shadows shifting with it. Thomas stood frozen, his body screaming to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. It reached for him, its fingers stretching long and twisted, covered in darkness. "No," Thomas whispered, his voice barely a breath. But it was too late. The figure's hand gripped his arm with unnatural strength, pulling him closer. "You think you can escape?" The voice rasped. "You are the vessel, Thomas. You cannot run from your fate, ***. The shadows began to pulse again, growing thicker, closer. Thomas felt the coldness of the void seep into his skin, numbing him. He couldn't break free. He couldn't escape. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and in that instant, he realized what had happened. The thing inside the shadows wasn't just trying to destroy him. It was trying to take him, and Claire's fate, it had been a warning. He was no longer just a man caught in her twisted game. He was the game. The grip on Thomas tightened, pulling him closer, the chill of the figure's touch crawling up his arm like ice. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears, louder than the growl that rumbled through the air. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows wrapped tighter around him, almost suffocating. The figure's eyes burned with the intensity of something ancient, something that had waited for this moment for centuries. "You are the vessel, Thomas," it repeated, its voice slithering into his mind like a poison. "You were never meant to escape. You were always the one who would bring it all back." A cold realization gripped him. The will, the inheritance. It had never been about money. It had always been about this, about him, about what he was meant to be. His mind screamed for clarity, for a way to break free, but all he could hear was the voice, the shadows, pressing in from all sides. "Yeah, you can't do this," he gasped, his voice barely audible. But the figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it began to pull him toward the open crack in the floor, a yawning abyss that seemed to call to him with a hunger all its own. His legs moved against his will, stumbling forward as if his body had become weightless, dragged by the pull of something far worse than death. And then the whispers started. They weren't just from the figure anymore. They were from the walls, the air. Every shadow in the room began to speak, a low, garbled chant, filling his mind with visions of endless darkness. He saw glimpses, shadows that formed into faces, faces that twisted and contorted in agony, faces that were now forever part of the void. He could feel his soul slipping away, his very essence being consumed. It's happening. The thought pierced through the chaos. I'm becoming one of them. In that moment, he understood. The creature wasn't simply taking him to some dark void. It was pulling him into it, into the endless depths of the shadows. He couldn't see the faces, but he could feel them. Thousands of lost souls, trapped forever in this abyss. No, he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the rising growl of the shadows. The figure's grip tightened once more. You cannot stop what has already begun, Thomas. You were always the last piece, and now you will become part of it. Forever. The crack beneath him widened further, and the abyss opened wide, a vast nothingness. But just as he was about to be consumed, something flickered, something faint, a light. It was small at first, barely noticeable amidst the endless dark, but it grew. It flickered once again, growing brighter with each passing second. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. The light, it was coming from somewhere behind him. He twisted in the figure's grip, his mind screaming, Asterisk, what is it? Where is it coming from? Asterisk. The figure let out a furious hiss, its hand tightening painfully on Thomas's arm. But Thomas could feel the pull of the light, something that could pull him away from this nightmare. With every ounce of his strength, he broke free from the figure's hold, his body lurching away from the abyss. He staggered backward, toward the light. The figure screeched, its form rippling with fury, but it couldn't stop him. Thomas pushed forward, his legs moving faster, the light growing closer, until, with a final surge of energy, he broke through. The light consumed him, and the shadows, the figure, everything disappeared. For a brief, fleeting moment, Thomas felt warmth. He felt air in his lungs, a sense of peace washing over him. But it was too soon. The light around him began to fade, and the darkness pressed in once more. The warmth flickered, fading like a candle in the wind. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as the darkness slowly crept back, filling the edges of his vision. The light had been a brief illusion, a moment of salvation that slipped away too quickly. He staggered, disoriented, his legs trembling beneath him. The shadows hadn't released their grip. No, they were only waiting for him to lose his will. The ground beneath him was solid, but it felt like it was shifting, like the earth itself was alive with hunger. He stumbled forward, looking around the room, but it was no longer the same. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, twisting and contorting, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear. His eyes widened as he saw it. The shadow from before, looming larger than ever. It wasn't just a creature anymore. It was a force, an ancient, terrifying presence that had once been contained, but now it was free. A voice echoed through the air, the same voice that had haunted him from the moment he entered the house. "You cannot escape, Thomas," it whispered, its words wrapping around him like a noose. "You were always meant to serve, and now you are the final key." The shadows began to shift, pulling in toward the center of the room, forming a vortex, a hole so deep and endless that it seemed to swallow everything around it. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. Escape? How could he escape when even the walls themselves were closing in? The light had vanished. There was no way out, no way to stop the impending doom. Asterisk, you will be mine, asterisk, the voice rumbled. Growing louder, the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for him with a ferocious hunger. His legs gave way beneath him. He fell to the ground, his hands bracing himself, but the floor felt like it was sinking, crumbling beneath him. His body trembled as the darkness began to swallow him whole. The voice spoke once more, its tone final, resonating in every corner of his mind. Asterisk, you were always the one, Thomas. You are the vessel, the bridge between worlds. And now, it is time to cross, asterisk. The shadows rushed forward, closing in on him, pulling him toward the swirling vortex. Desperation clawed at his chest, but there was no fighting it now, no resisting. As the shadows enveloped him, he felt his consciousness slipping away. The last thing he saw was the center of the vortex, a glowing crimson light, flickering at its core, and then there was nothing. The darkness had swallowed Thomas whole, but it wasn't the end. He opened his eyes. The first thing he felt was the chill, cold, so cold, that it sank into his very bones. His body ached, his skin prickling with the sensation of an endless void. The shadows, though, had retreated. He was no longer in the house, no longer trapped in the suffocating room where Claire had fallen. The air around him was thick, but it wasn't oppressive. It was waiting. Thomas stood up, his legs unsteady, like he had been asleep for years. The floor beneath him was uneven, like a cracked stone surface. He looked around, but all he could see was darkness, a vast expanse stretching out in every direction, as if he were standing in the heart of a great abyss. But then, in the distance, a faint light. He could barely make out its shape, a glowing, pale light flickering at the edge of the nothingness. It beckoned to him. He moved toward it, his feet heavy, the cold still seeping into him. But the light, it felt different. As he neared it, he could make out shapes, figures standing in a circle, silent and still, their eyes fixed on him. Their faces were unfamiliar, but their presence was unmistakable. They were part of this world, this place beyond reality, beyond death. One of them stepped forward, its voice a low murmur, so quiet that Thomas had to strain to hear. Asterisk, welcome, Thomas, asterisk. It was not a voice he recognized, but something ancient, something eternal. You have crossed over, but you are not alone. Thomas's pulse quickened, his heart racing with dread. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The figure moved closer, its gaze cold but not unkind. You are part of it now, part of the darkness you've unleashed. You will not be the last. The words felt like a weight on his chest. It was a fate he hadn't expected, and it was too late to turn back. The light flickered again, this time stronger, and in the distance, a new figure appeared, a shadow that looked remarkably like Claire. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he knew the true meaning of forever. Thomas stood still, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He was no longer in the realm of the living, but he wasn't quite dead either. He was caught somewhere between two worlds, a place where time and space had no meaning. The figures around him were silent, their eyes staring, waiting. But there was something different now, something in the air that shifted, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear. The shadow of Claire stepped forward, her face still twisted with that eerie, haunting expression. Her eyes, though, were filled with a strange, profound emptiness, a vacancy that made his heart lurch. She raised her hand, her fingers outstretched as if to touch him, but she didn't move. She was waiting. Thomas took a tentative step toward her, his breath shallow, his thoughts racing. Was this the end? Had it always been meant to end this way? Claire's lips barely parted, her voice a whisper, carried on the heavy silence of the abyss. Asterisk, you don't belong here. Thomas, asterisk. Her words hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, but there was no escape now, no turning back. His mind flooded with memories of his life, his marriage, his desperate attempts to escape this cursed path. It was all gone. The life he once knew, the love he thought he had, it was all lost, swept away by the shadows, by the pull of something far older than himself. Claire's figure began to fade, dissolving into the light, like smoke in the wind, and with it, the cold weight that had burdened him for so long lifted. The darkness began to recede, the figures slowly vanishing, until there was nothing left but the faint glow of the light, warm and comforting. Thomas took a deep breath, his heart finally slowing. He felt the warmth seep into his body, washing away the chill, the fear. He was free. As the light enveloped him fully, he closed his eyes, letting go of the pain, the regret, the darkness. And in the quiet calm that followed, he realized something. It wasn't about escaping. It was about accepting. Finally, Thomas was at peace.